This game would be a lot more challenging if there were enemies in the world to avoid. In this video, we'll add enemies to the game. Our objectives will be to create an enemy game object and set it up. In doing so, we will review several of the concepts that we've covered so far. Okay, we're going to create our enemy game object, and to do this, we're going to harken back to our first project where we created just primitive assets. So I could use some of the prototyping assets, but for sake of example, let's go up and say create 3D object and make a cube. Okay, so the cube is created. It's not in the center, so let me go ahead and reset that so we can see it. It's essentially a 1 by 1 by 1 cube. Let me select that here in the scene view. Oh, I'm still in 2D mode. Let me switch back to 3D and drag this up. And of course, I want to rename this not cube. I want to name it enemy. And we need to create a material, so let me go ahead and look at my materials. I'm going to base this off of the death zone material. So let me go ahead and select that and then duplicate it and rename it my enemy material. And let's change the albedo texture from the white swatch to an orange swatch. And I'm going to change the tint color back to just pure white. So it's going to be kind of an orange looking enemy. And now that that material is set up, I'm going to go ahead and drag and drop it on the cube. So we've got an orange enemy. So there's various components or scripts that we need to attach to the enemy to make it do what it needs to do. So let me go ahead and choose add component, go down to scripts. One of those is the chaser script. So the chaser script basically makes a game object chase another game object, which is exactly what we want our enemy to do. So let me choose that. You can see there's a speed. Right now it's 20. Just by testing before, I know this is pretty fast, so let me change this to something like 4. Minimum distance is how close will it get. I'm going to say 0, so it would try to get right on top of the enemy if possible. And then there's a target. So the target we can specify as rollerball. Basically, the way the script works, though, is if the target isn't specified, it will default to a player tagged game object. But let me go ahead and specify that to start out with. Okay, we have the chaser set up. Let me go ahead and play this so you can see that. Right now it's right on my ball, so my ball fell right on top of it. But you can see the enemy is essentially chasing me around the world. Notice it is going through bumpers because we haven't fully set up the enemy yet with colliders and that sort of thing. So the first thing that I'll do is I'll actually move the enemy away from the player at the beginning of the game. So let me just drag it over here. Maybe I'll make it so we can kind of just see it in the camera right there on the edge. So let's add a few additional components. So we do need a rigid body because we want this to collide with things like the bumpers. So let's go ahead and add physics and add the rigid body. Once again, you can modify the mass and drag and so forth. I'm just going to leave everything at the defaults for now. I do want this to use gravity just like the player, so it will fall off the world just like the player will. It's going to be affected by forces, so I will not check is kinematic. So the other thing that I might want to do is it already has a box collider on it, but there's no physics material. Let me go ahead and make this bouncy, so the enemies kind of bounce off the ground depending on how high they are when they originally appear in the world. So right now, if I once again zoom in on this, it's pretty much right on the ground. So let me move it up a little bit. Once again, if I want to be precise, I could snap it or just go over and type. So I'll start it at 2 meters high and go ahead and try that. So let's just hit play. You can see now that it won't travel through bumpers, so we can kind of block it, get away from it. But the enemy isn't really doing any damage yet. It's just kind of getting in our way. So just like with the death zone, we need to add a damage script on the enemy. So let me go and say add component, scripts, pick damage. We could define the amount of damage. I'm going to just leave it at 10 because I do want it to kill my player on contact because 10 is greater than 1. I don't have a trigger right now. I could actually create a second collider on this, so you can actually have multiple colliders. So I can have one collider that's not a trigger and bouncy, so it interacts with physics. And I could have a second collider that is a trigger that would detect a trigger collision. But this script is actually set up to also have the option of damage on collision. So I'll switch to damage on collision. And the final thing that I want to do is I want to give the enemy health, just like the player, because I want the enemies to die as well when maybe they run into each other or when they fall off the world and run into the ground. So let me add the component for health. And once again, I'll leave it with the defaults. So let's go ahead and play. You can see the enemies come in pretty quickly, so maybe I need to adjust their speed a little bit. But once I get moving, I am able to get away from it if I focus on that. So we have our enemy pretty well set up, so let's make it into a prefab by dragging the game object into our prefab folder to create a enemy prefab. And let's go ahead and add 2 enemies to the world to start out with. Once again, let's position it. So I'm going to make this, maybe 2 meters high, and let's do a top-down view. And I'll position both of these guys to be kind of at the far extremities of the world so they don't attack me immediately before I have a chance to start moving. And just like the coins, it might be nice to have an empty game object to organize my enemies. So I'll call this enemies. I'll set it back to the origin, and then I'll drag my enemies into that empty game object. So let's go ahead and try this. So you can see the 2 enemies up there in the scene view are chasing me. If I'm good enough, I can see if I can get them to run into each other. Might be a little tricky to do that. There, they just destroyed each other. In the next video, we'll add visual and audio polish to the game through particle effects and additional sound effects.